One of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. He led the nation through the American Civil War, the country's greatest moral, cultural, constitutional, and political crisis. He succeeded in preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, bolstering the federal government, and modernizing the US economy. Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today, let's learn about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809 near Hodgenville, Kentucky, United States, and he died on April 15, 1865 in Washington, D.C. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th President of the United States from 1861 to 1865, who preserved the Union during the American Civil War and brought about the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. Among American heroes, Abraham Lincoln continues to have a unique appeal for his fellow countrymen and also for people of other lands. This charm derives from his remarkable life story, the rise from humble origins, the dramatic death, and from his distinctively human and humane personality, as well as from his historical role as savior of the Union and emancipator of enslaved people. Abraham Lincoln's relevance endures and grows especially because of his eloquence as a spokesman for democracy. In his view, the Union was worth saving not only for its own sake, but because it embodied an ideal, the ideal of self-government. In recent years, the political side to Lincoln's character and his racial views in particular have come under close scrutiny as scholars continue to find him a rich subject for research. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated to him on May 30, 1922. Let's learn about the life of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was born in a backwoods cabin 3 miles south of Hodgenville, Kentucky, and was taken to a farm in the neighboring valley of Knob Creek when he was 2 years old. Lincoln's earliest memories were of his home, and in particular of a flash flood that once washed away the corn and pumpkin seeds he had helped his father plant. Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a descendant of a weaver's apprentice who had migrated from England to Massachusetts in 1637. Though much less prosperous than some of his Lincoln forebears, Thomas was a sturdy pioneer. On June 12, 1806, he married Nancy Hanks. The Hanks genealogy is difficult to trace, but Nancy appears to have been of illegitimate birth. She has been described as stoop-shouldered, thin-breasted, sad, and fervently religious. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln had 3 children, Sarah Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Lincoln, who died in infancy. Let's learn about the childhood and youth of Abraham Lincoln. In December 1816, faced with a lawsuit challenging the title to his Kentucky farm, Thomas Lincoln moved with his family to southwestern Indiana. There, as a squatter on public land, he hastily put up a half-faced camp, a crude structure of logs and boughs with one side open to the weather, in which the family took shelter behind a blazing fire. Soon he built a permanent cabin, and later he bought the land on which it stood. Abraham helped to clear the fields and to take care of the crops, but early acquired a dislike for hunting and fishing. In after years, Abraham recalled in his own words the panther's scream, the bears that preyed on the swine, and the poverty of Indiana frontier life, which was pretty pinching at times. The unhappiest period of his boyhood followed the death of his mother in the autumn of 1818. As a ragged 9-year-old, Abraham saw her buried in the forest, then faced a winter without the warmth of a mother's love. Fortunately, before the onset of a second winter, Thomas Lincoln brought home from Kentucky a new wife for himself, a new mother for the children. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, a widow with 2 girls and a boy of her own, had energy and affection to spare. She ran the household with an even hand, treating both sets of children as if she had borne them all, but she became especially fond of Abraham and he of her. Abraham afterward referred to her as his angel mother. Abraham's stepmother doubtlessly encouraged Lincoln's taste for reading, yet the original source of his desire to learn remains something of a mystery. Both his parents were almost completely illiterate, and he himself received little formal education. Abraham once said that as a boy he had gone to school by littles, a little now and little then, and his entire schooling amounted to no more than 1 year's attendance. His neighbors later recalled how he used to trudge for miles to borrow a book. According to his own statement, however, his early surroundings provided absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education. Of course, when I came of age, I did not know much. Still, somehow I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of 3, but that was all. Apparently, the young Lincoln did not read a large number of books, but thoroughly absorbed the few that he did read. These included Parson Weems' Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington, with its story of the Little Hatchet and the Cherry Tree, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. From his earliest days, Abraham must have some familiarity with the Bible, for it doubtlessly was the only book his family owned. In March 1830, the Lincoln family undertook a second migration, this time to Illinois, with Lincoln himself driving the team of oxen. Having just reached the age of 21, Abraham Lincoln was about to begin life on his own. 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was raw-boned and lanky but muscular and physically powerful. He was especially noted for the skill and strength with which he could wield an axe. He spoke with a backwoods twang and walked in the long-striding, flat-footed, cautious manner of a ploughman. Good-natured, though somewhat moody, talented as a mimic and storyteller, he readily attracted friends. But Abraham Lincoln was yet to demonstrate whatever other abilities he possessed. After his arrival in Illinois, having no desire to be a farmer, Lincoln tried his hand at a variety of occupations. As a rail splitter, he helped to clear and fence his father's new farm. As a flatboatman, he made a voyage down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, Louisiana. Upon his return to Illinois, Abraham Lincoln settled in New Salem, a village of about 25 families on the Sangamon River. There he worked from time to time as storekeeper, postmaster, and surveyor. With the coming of the Black Hawk War in 1832, Abraham Lincoln listed as a volunteer and was elected captain of his company. Afterward, Abraham Lincoln joked that he had seen no live fighting Indians during the war, but had had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. Meanwhile, aspiring to be a legislator, Abraham Lincoln was defeated in his first try and then repeatedly re-elected to the state assembly. He considered blacksmithing as a trade, but finally decided in favor of the law. Already having taught himself grammar and mathematics, Abraham Lincoln began to study law books. In 1836, having passed the bar examination, he began to practice law. Let's learn about Abraham Lincoln as a prairie lawyer. The next year, Abraham Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois, the new state capital, which offered many more opportunities for a lawyer than New Salem did. At first, Lincoln was a partner of John T. Stuart, then of Stephen T. Logan, and finally from 1854 of William H. Herndon. Nearly 10 years younger than Lincoln, Herndon was more widely read, more emotional at the bar, and generally more extreme in his views. Yet this partnership seems to have been as nearly perfect as such human arrangements ever are. Lincoln and Herndon kept few records of their law business, and they split the cash between them whenever either of them was paid. It seems they had no money quarrels. Within a few years of his relocation to Springfield, Lincoln was earning $1,200 to $1,500 annually, at a time when the governor of the state received a salary of $1,200 and circuit judges only $750. He had to work hard. To keep himself busy, he found it necessary not only to practice in the capital but also to follow the court as it made the rounds of its circuit. Each spring and fall, he would set out by horseback or buggy to travel hundreds of miles over the thinly settled prairie from one little county seat to another. Most of the cases were petty and the fees small. The coming of the railroads, especially after 1850, made travel easier and practice more remunerative. Lincoln served as a lobbyist for the Illinois Central Railroad, assisting it in getting a charter from the state, and thereafter he was retained as a regular attorney for that railroad. After successfully defending the company against the efforts of McLean County to tax its property, Abraham Lincoln received the largest single fee of his legal career, $5,000. He also handled cases for other railroads and for banks, insurance companies, and mercantile and manufacturing firms. In one of his finest performances before the bar, he saved the Rock Island Bridge, the first to span the Mississippi River, from the threat of the river transportation interests that demanded the bridge's removal. His business included a number of patent suits and criminal trials. One of his most effective and famous pleas had to do with a murder case. A witness claimed that by the light of the moon he had seen Duff Armstrong, an acquaintance of Lincoln's, take part in a killing. Referring to an almanac for proof, Lincoln argued that the night had been too dark for the witness to have seen anything clearly, and with a sincere and moving appeal he won an acquittal. By the time Abraham Lincoln began to be prominent in national politics, about 20 years after launching his legal career, he had made himself one of the most distinguished and successful lawyers in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln was noted not only for his shrewdness and practical common sense, which enabled him always to see to the heart of any legal case, but also for his invariable fairness and utter honesty. Let's learn about Lincoln's family. While residing in New Salem, Lincoln became acquainted with Anne Rutledge. Apparently, he was fond of her, and certainly he grieved with the entire community at her untimely death in 1835 at the age of 22. Afterward, stories were told of a grand romance between Lincoln and Rutledge, but these stories are not supported by sound historical evidence. A year after the death of Rutledge, Lincoln carried on a half-hearted courtship with Mary Owens, who eventually concluded that Lincoln was deficient in those little links which make up the chain of woman's happiness. She turned down his proposal. So far as can be known, the first and only real love of Lincoln's life was Mary Todd. High-spirited, quick-witted, and well-educated, Todd came from a rather distinguished Kentucky family, and her Springfield relatives belonged to the social aristocracy of the town. Some of them frowned upon her association with Lincoln, and from time to time he too doubted whether he could ever make her happy. Nevertheless, they became engaged. Then, on a day in 1841 that Lincoln recalled as the fatal 1st of January, the engagement was broken, apparently on his initiative. For some time afterward, Lincoln was overwhelmed by terrible depression and despondency. Finally, the two were reconciled, and on November 4, 1842, they married. 4 children, all boys, were born to the Lincolns. Edward Baker was nearly 4 years old when he died, and William Wallace, or Willie, was 11. Robert Todd, the eldest, was the only one of the children to survive to adulthood. Lincoln's favorite, Thomas Tad, who had cleft palate and a lisp, outlived his father. Lincoln left the upbringing of his children largely to their mother, who was alternately strict and lenient in her treatment of them. The Lincolns had a mutual affectionate interest in the doings and welfare of their boys, were fond of one another's company and missed each other when apart, as existing letters show. Like most married couples, the Lincolns also had their domestic quarrels, which sometimes were hectic but which undoubtedly were exaggerated by contemporary gossips. She suffered from recurring headaches, fits of temper, and a sense of insecurity and loneliness that was intensified by her husband's long absences on the lawyer's circuit. After his election to the presidency, she was afflicted by the death of her son Willie and by the ironies of a war that made enemies of Kentucky relatives and friends, and by the unfair public criticisms of her as mistress of the White House. She developed an obsessive need to spend money and she ran up embarrassing bills. She also staged some painful scenes of wifely jealousy. At last, in 1875, she was officially declared insane, though by that time she had undergone the future shock of seeing her husband murdered at her side. During their earlier married life, she unquestionably encouraged her husband and served as a prod to his own ambition. During their later years together, she probably strengthened and tested his innate qualities of tolerance and patience. With his wife, Lincoln attended Presbyterian services in Springfield and in Washington but never joined any church. He once explained, "Early in life, Lincoln had been something of a skeptic and free thinker. His reputation had been such that, as he once complained, the church influence was used against him in politics." When running for Congress in 1846, he issued a handbill to deny that he ever had spoken with intentional disrespect of religion. He went on to explain that he had believed in the doctrine of necessity. That is, that the human mind is impelled to action or held in rest by some power over which the mind itself has no control. Throughout his life, he also believed in dreams and other enigmatic signs and portents. As he grew older, and especially after he became president and faced the soul-troubling responsibilities of the Civil War, he developed a profound religious sense, and he increasingly personified necessity as God. He came to look upon himself quite humbly as an instrument of providence and to view all history as God's enterprise. In the present Civil War, he wrote in 1862, "It is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities working just as they do are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose." Lincoln was fond of the Bible and knew it well. He also was fond of Shakespeare. In private conversation, he used many Shakespearean allusions, discussed problems of dramatic interpretation with considerable insight, and recited long passages from memory with rare feeling and understanding. He liked the works of John Stuart Mill, particularly on liberty, but disliked heavy or metaphysical works. Though he enjoyed the poems of Lord Byron and Robert Burns, his favorite piece of verse was the work of an obscure Scottish poet, William Knox. Lincoln often quoted Knox's lines beginning, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" He liked to relax with the comic writings of Petroleum V. Nasby, Orpheus C. Kerr, and Artemus Ward, or with a visit to the popular theatre. Thank you for listening to this discussion on Abraham Lincoln's childhood and youth, about his life as a prairie lawyer, and about his family. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store.